Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, has an old letter or a faded page ever kept you thinking long after the lamp was lit? Some pages, Watson found, hide more beneath their ink than upon it. Do subscribe, so no forgotten page escapes your notice. Now settle in and listen closely, for as Holmes believed, nothing written by human hand is entirely free of truth. You'll find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. Link below. Chapter 1. The House of Ashcombe. It was upon a bitter evening in November, with a sleet-laden wind rattling the windows of our sitting room in Baker Street, that I first heard the name of Ashcombe spoken beneath our roof. Holmes had been in one of his silent moods for the better part of the afternoon, reclining in his chair with his fingertips pressed together and his eyes half closed, so that I could not tell whether he was asleep or merely absorbed in some chain of reasoning too fine for interruption. The fire had burned low, and I had just risen to attend to it when the bell sounded below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice and a lighter, more hesitant one in reply. "A visitor, Watson, and a lady, unless I am very much mistaken," said Holmes without opening his eyes. "The tread is too light for a man, and too deliberate for a servant sent upon an errand. She has climbed the stair slowly, as one does who is uncertain whether she ought to have come at all." I had long since ceased to marvel openly at such observations, though I confess I never lost my private wonder at them. A moment later Mrs. Hudson showed in a lady of perhaps 45 years, dressed in mourning of a quality that spoke of good family, fallen upon careful economy rather than poverty. She was composed, in the manner of one who has trained herself to composure through long practice, but I noted the restless motion of her gloved hands and the shadow beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. I must apologise for calling at so late an hour and without appointment, but I did not know where else I might turn." "Pray sit by the fire, Lady Eleanor," said Holmes, rising and drawing forward a chair. "Dr. Watson's discretion is as complete as my own, and you may speak freely before him. You have come a considerable distance, I think, and upon a matter that has troubled you for some little while, though the crisis is a recent one." She looked at him with some astonishment. "How could you know that?" "Your boots are of a pattern not sold in London, but I have seen their like in Guildford. The mud upon them is fresh from within the hour, yet the lines about your eyes did not form themselves in a single night. Pray continue." Thus encouraged, Lady Eleanor told us her history, and I set it down here as faithfully as memory allows, for it was the foundation upon which so much was afterward built. She was, she explained, the widow of the younger of two Ashcombe brothers, and resided still at Ashcombe Hall, the family seat in Surrey, under the governance of her brother-in-law, Sir Reginald Ashcombe, the present holder of the baronetcy. The Ashcombes, she said, were not a family of great wealth, but they possessed broad lands and an old name, and it was upon the unquestioned legitimacy of that name that the whole structure of their fortunes depended. "Sir Reginald has always been a man of exacting principle," she said. "He has spent his life, I think, in the guarding of the family's reputation, sometimes at the expense of its comfort. But some weeks ago he announced, without warning, that he intended to make public certain documents concerning the birth and baptism of my nephew Edward." "Edward being," Holmes interposed, "the heir presumptive." "Just so. He is the son of Sir Reginald's late brother Charles, and of Charles's wife Beatrice, both long since dead. Edward is 27, charming, I will not deny it, but reckless with money and deeply in debt. His position as heir has never before been questioned. Yet Sir Reginald now speaks of comparing the certified copy of the baptismal record against the original entry in the parish register, as though he suspected some irregularity in it." She went on to describe the household with a precision that told me she had thought long and carefully upon each member of it. There was Clara Ashcombe, Sir Reginald's niece, who wished to marry a physician of good character, but modest means, a match her uncle considered beneath her. There was Major Hugh Penrose, a distant cousin, who who would inherit the title should Edward be found illegitimate, though Lady Eleanor was at pains to insist that the Major sought no such thing. There was Mrs. Margaret Bell, the housekeeper, who had served the family since Edward's infancy, and who guarded, in Lady Eleanor's words, the private history of the house with an intensity I have never fully understood. And there was the Reverend Samuel Hargreaves, the vicar of the parish, whom Sir Reginald had recently asked to examine the old registers. "And you believe," said Holmes, "that something more dangerous than a legal dispute lies behind this sudden interest of your brother-in-law's?" "I don't know what I believe, Mr. Holmes. I know only that the house has become a place of whispers and closed doors, where once it was open and dull and safe. None of them, I am certain, is capable of violence, and yet I am afraid." Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes upon the fire. "Lady Eleanor," he said at length, "inheritance disputes are rarely, in my experience, about property alone. A title is a kind of currency more jealously guarded than gold, precisely because it cannot be replenished. I will come down to Ashcombe Hall and Watson with me, and we shall see what manner of ghost it is that walks your corridors." She thanked him with evident relief, and having arranged the particulars of our visit for the following day, took her leave into the sleet from which she had come. Holmes stood long at the window, watching her carriage lamps recede into the murk of the street. "What do you make of it, Watson? A family quarrel over an old baptismal record, surely nothing more sinister than pride." "Perhaps," said he, "but I have observed, in the long course of my work, that when a proud man begins to examine the foundations of his own house, it is seldom out of idle curiosity. Something has disturbed Sir Reginald Ashcombe, and I confess I am eager to learn what manner of thing it was." With that he fell again into silence, and I, for my part, sat long into the night turning over in my mind the strange and troubled household to which the morrow would carry us. Chapter 2. The Register in the Library. Ashcombe Hall stood at the end of a long avenue of limes, its grey stone front softened by neither ivy nor welcome, and I confess that my first sight of it, through the streaming windows of the trap that had met us at the station, gave me a presentiment of the coldness we should find within. The rain had followed us down from London, and it beat upon the gravel sweep as we descended, so that we were glad enough to pass beneath the shelter of the great porch, though little warmer, I think, for having done so. We were received not by Lady Eleanor, who had gone ahead of us the previous day, but by a manservant of grave and ancient aspect, who conducted us directly to the library, where Sir Reginald Ashcombe awaited us. He was a tall man of some 60 years, spare in frame, with the upright bearing of one who has never in his life permitted himself to slouch, and a face so schooled to impassivity that I found it difficult, even after some minutes' conversation, to read anything in it at all. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending a hand that was cool and dry, "I confess I did not welcome my sister-in-law's decision to bring in outside assistance. I am a private man, and this is a private matter, but she assures me of your discretion, and I will own that discretion is precisely what this affair requires." "Discretion, Sir Reginald, and truth," said Holmes, seating himself uninvited in the chair nearest the great desk. "The two are not always compatible, but I have generally found that the pursuit of the one serves the other better than its abandonment." Sir Reginald's mouth tightened very slightly, and he crossed to a cabinet of dark oak, from which he produced a document in a leather folder. "This," he said, laying it before us, "is a certified copy of the baptismal entry recording the christening of my nephew Edward, son of my late brother Charles and his wife Beatrice, 27 years ago this coming spring. It states plainly that the child was born in lawful wedlock." Holmes studied the paper with care, though I could see that his interest lay less in its wording than in the manner of its owner. "And you doubt its accuracy?" "I have recently come into possession of another document," said Sir Reginald, "which suggests that my brother and his wife may not have been lawfully married until some weeks after Edward's birth. I do not say that I believe it. I say only that I cannot, in conscience, permit the question to rest unexamined, when the whole succession of this family depends upon its answer. May I ask the source of this second document? You may ask, Mr. Holmes, but I do not intend to answer. It is enough that I have it, and that I mean to resolve the matter beyond all doubt by comparing this certified copy against the original register, still kept at the parish church. I have arranged with the Reverend Hargreaves to make the comparison tomorrow morning. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow very slightly at this refusal, though he pressed the point no further, and I understood, as I had come to understand after some years in his company, that he had filed the fact away rather than abandoned it. We spoke a little longer of the household, and Sir Reginald named, with evident distaste at the necessity, each person who dwelt beneath his roof, much as Lady Eleanor had done, though with a coldness that made each name sound almost like an accusation. It was at dinner that evening that I first observed the household together, and I will set down here, as exactly as I am able, what passed, for Holmes afterward told me that the true history of the case began not in the library but at that table. The company was small, Sir Reginald at its head, Lady Eleanor to his right, and ranged about the polished mahogany Edward Ashcombe, a handsome, fair young man whose smile came too readily to be entirely without effort, Clara Ashcombe, dark-haired and watchful, who spoke little, Major Hugh Penrose, weathered and soldierly, with the restless air of a man impatient to be elsewhere, and standing rather than seated, for she did not dine with the family, Mrs. Margaret Bell, who came in twice to see to the service, and remained a moment longer than her duties strictly required. It was over the second course that Sir Reginald, without preamble, announced to the table what he had already told us in the library, that the matter of Edward's legitimacy would be settled the following morning, when the certified copy was compared against the parish register itself. I watched, as instructed, the faces rather than the plates. Edward went pale beneath his fair skin, and his hand, I noticed, closed hard upon the stem of his wine-glass without lifting it. Major Penrose, who might reasonably have been expected to receive the announcement with some private satisfaction, wore instead an expression of plain embarrassment, and addressed himself to his plate with unusual concentration. It was Mrs. Bell, entering at that moment with a fresh dish, who gave the most visible start of all, so that a spoon slipped from the tray and rang loudly upon the floor, a small accident that none the less silenced the table for a long moment. But it was Lady Eleanor who drew my particular attention, for in that silence, when every other eye had turned toward the fallen spoon, or towards Sir Reginald himself, hers had gone not to her brother-in-law but to the housekeeper, and rested there with an expression I could not at the time interpret, though I thought I read in it something closer to dread than surprise. Later, when we had withdrawn to the room set aside for us, Holmes stood long at the window looking out over the dark lawns, and it was some minutes before he spoke. "You observed the table, Watson?" "I did." Edward seemed genuinely alarmed, and Major Penrose oddly reluctant for a man who stands to gain by the discovery. "And Mrs. Bell? Startled enough to drop a spoon, though servants are easily startled by their masters' quarrels." "Quite so. But consider this, Watson." He turned from the window, and his face in the lamplight had taken on that keen, inward look I had learned to associate with the true beginning of a case. Of all those at that table, Mrs. Bell alone stands to gain nothing and lose nothing, whatever the register reveals. She is neither heir nor rival, neither lover nor guardian of another's fortune, and yet I tell you plainly that hers was the most revealing reaction of the evening, precisely because it had no apparent reason to occur at all. Chapter 3. The Locked Morning Room. I was woken before 7 by a hammering upon our door, and Holmes, who I believe had scarcely slept at all, was already drawing on his dressing-gown before I had fully opened my eyes. It was the manservant who had admitted us the previous day, his composure quite gone, his face grey with the particular fright of a man who has never before had cause for alarm and does not know how to carry it. "Sir Reginald, gentlemen. He is in the morning room, and will not answer, and the door is locked from within." We found the household already gathered in the passage outside the morning room, a small chamber adjoining the library, its door of solid oak fast shut. Lady Eleanor stood pale and silent with a hand upon the frame, Edward paced a few restless steps and back again. Clara held Mrs. Bell's arm as though to steady one or the other of them. I could not tell which. Holmes wasted no time upon questions, but set his shoulder to the door, and between us we forced the lock, which gave with a splintering crack that seemed unnaturally loud in that hushed corridor. Sir Reginald lay upon the floor near the hearth, insensible, a wound above his temple from which blood had dried in a dark trail across his brow. A heavy bronze paperweight, of the kind that had stood upon his library desk, lay near his outflung hand, itself marked with blood. I knelt at once and made such examination as my profession permits, and found with some relief that he breathed still, though his pulse was faint and his stupor deep. "He lives," I said, "but he has taken a heavy blow, and I cannot say when, or if, he will wake to tell us how." Holmes said nothing for a moment, his eyes moving swiftly about the room, from the cold hearth to the shuttered window, from the overturned chair to the desk where, I now observed, the leather folder that had held the certified baptismal copy lay open and empty. "The record is gone," said he quietly, and then, raising his voice, "Someone must ride at once for the police, and for Dr. Watson's colleague if the village boasts one, though I think the doctor's own skill will serve Sir Reginald better than any stranger's. Let no one touch this room until I have finished with it." Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour, summoned by wire from the nearest town, and I confess I was glad of his brisk, familiar presence amid so much unfamiliar grief. He listened to the household's account with the air of a man already forming his conclusions, and it was not long before those conclusions settled, as I had half expected they would, upon Edward Ashcombe. "He quarrelled with his uncle last night by every account," said Lestrade to us privately, "and he admits himself that he came to this very room before midnight. A servant saw him in the passage, and he is a young man deep in debt, Mr. Holmes, with everything to lose by what that register might have shown, and everything to gain by its destruction." Edward, when questioned, did not deny the visit. "I came to beg him not to make the matter public," he said, his voice unsteady, but, to my ear, sincere. I thought only of the shame of it, the talk it would cause. I didn't raise my hand against him, Inspector, I swear it. I left him well, sitting at that very desk, and went to my room. It was evidence enough on its face to satisfy a jury, and I saw that even Lestrade regarded the matter as very nearly closed. But Holmes, who had said little during these exchanges, now moved about the room with the silent, methodical attention I had seen him give to 100 such scenes before, and it was clear from the set of his shoulders that he found the case a good deal less simple than the inspector did. "Consider the hearth, Lestrade," said he at last, crouching before the cold grate. "Sir Reginald is said to have entered this room and had it sealed against interruption at 10 o'clock. Yet here are ashes, and among them the curled remnant of paper burned some hours later than that, for the grate had been swept clean earlier in the evening, upon Mrs. Bell's own testimony. Papers do not burn themselves at midnight in an empty room." He rose and crossed to the mantel, where a small clock ticked, with what I now saw was a false confidence. "This clock, gentlemen, is 23 minutes slow, and has been set so deliberately, for the mechanism shows no sign of natural drift. And here," he continued, drawing from his pocket a lens and bending over a small silver tray upon the side table, "is a tea-tray, ordered for Sir Reginald at 10:30, and never delivered, though the order stands written plainly upon the household board. Why should a man's tea go undelivered on the very night he desired privacy above all things?" Lestrade, who had followed this recitation with a mixture of impatience and grudging attention, spread his hands. "Servants forget things, Mr. Holmes. It proves nothing against Edward Ashcombe." "Perhaps not directly," said Holmes, "but there is one thing more." He had crossed to the door itself and now held up, upon the tip of one finger, the key that had lain within the locked room. This key, Lestrade, bears a faint film of wax upon its wards, such as is left when a key is pressed into a softened block to take its impression. I put it to you that this door was not locked by magic, nor by any trick of bolts, but by an ordinary key, turned from within by someone who possessed a duplicate made in secret, and who wished us to believe that no one but Sir Reginald himself could have been present. The inspector regarded the key with rather more respect than he had shown it a moment before, though I could see he was not yet prepared to abandon his theory of Edward's guilt. Someone, Holmes went on, half to himself, has taken great care to arrange the appearance of a night on which Sir Reginald sat alone and sealed away from every living soul in this house. And a man does not go to such trouble, Watson, merely to strike another man down in a fit of temper. He goes to such trouble because he has planned most carefully to be somewhere else entirely when the blow is struck. Chapter 4. A Schedule, written twice. Lestrade's theory, once formed, possessed the simplicity that I have often observed to recommend itself to the official mind above all other virtues. Edward Ashcombe, fearing that the morning's comparison would strip him of his inheritance, had gone to his uncle under cover of a private appeal, had struck him down in the course of some heated exchange, had contrived by some means to lock the door behind him, and had carried off the certified record before attempting, in a final act of concealment, to burn whatever papers might further implicate him. The motive, as Lestrade saw it, required no subtlety of interpretation. It was money, plain and simple, dressed in the borrowed clothes of family pride. "It is a tidy theory, Lestrade," said Holmes, when the inspector had laid it before us in the library that afternoon. "And tidy theories are, in my experience, the ones most likely to have been tidied by someone other than Providence." He had spent the better part of the morning in a slow and patient examination of the household itself, beginning with the duty board that hung in the passage outside the servants' hall, a slate upon which the housekeeper recorded each day's particular arrangements. I accompanied him thither, and saw at once what had drawn his interest, for the surface of the board, though wiped as usual each evening, bore still the faint ghost of an earlier hand beneath the chalk schedule now displayed, as though it had been written, erased, and written again within a short space of time. "Mrs. Bell," said Holmes when that lady was summoned, "can you tell me why the arrangements for last evening were altered after they had first been set down?" She met his eye steadily enough, though I thought her fingers, folded before her, had gone very still. "Sir Reginald himself ordered the changes, Mr. Holmes. He wished the tea service put back, and the fires banked earlier than usual. It is not for me to question my master's instructions." It was a plausible answer, delivered without hesitation, and might have satisfied a less exacting inquirer. But when the butler, a dry and precise man named Ffoulkes, who had served the family above 30 years, was asked the same question apart from her hearing, his reply was a good deal less accommodating. "Sir Reginald never altered an arrangement in this house, sir, without initialling the change himself upon the board, that we might have no confusion or blame laid wrongly. It was his own rule, and a strict one. I saw no such initials last evening, though I confess I did not think to remark upon their absence until this moment." Holmes received this with the particular quiet that I had learned to recognise as satisfaction rather than surprise. "A small thing, Watson, but small things are the very stuff of which the truth is generally woven, while large things are so often woven by those who wish to deceive us." It was in the course of that same afternoon that a further discrepancy came to light, this time concerning the Reverend Hargreaves. That gentleman, an amiable, rather absent-minded clergyman of late middle age, called at the hall in some distress, explaining that he had been expected the previous evening at 10:15 to begin the very examination of the parish register that Sir Reginald had proposed, but had received instead a handwritten note, delivered by hand, postponing the visit until the following morning. "I confess I thought it a trifle odd," said the vicar, producing the note itself from his coat, "for Sir Reginald was not a man given to changing his plans without good cause stated, but I saw no reason to doubt it came from him." Holmes took the paper and studied it beneath his lens for a long moment, holding it also to the window that he might examine it against the light. "The hand is a careful imitation, Mr. Hargreaves, and would deceive most eyes readily enough. But observe here, Watson, the manner in which the letter S is formed, without the small backward hook that I noted in Sir Reginald's own correspondence in the library, and the crossing of the T as a fraction too deliberate, as of one copying a model rather than writing from long habit. This note was not written by Sir Reginald Ashcombe, though its author took considerable pains that we should believe otherwise. This discovery, taken with the altered schedule, satisfied Holmes that some hand other than Sir Reginald's own had been busy in the household during the hours preceding the assault, arranging matters so that the master of the house should be left entirely alone, without visitor, without servant, and without the ordinary interruptions of an evening, at precisely the hour when he had proposed to settle the question of the register once and for all. There remained the matter of a sealed cupboard that stood in the corner of the morning room itself, containing, by Sir Reginald's own account, certain old family papers of no immediate relevance to the case. Its wax seal, stamped with the Ashcombe crest, appeared upon first inspection entirely intact, and Lestrade had been inclined to dismiss it from his considerations altogether. Holmes, however, examined it with his lens for some minutes, turning the cupboard door this way and that beneath the light. A seal, Lestrade, proves only that a thing has been sealed. It says nothing whatever as to when, nor how many times. He said no more upon the subject then, though I saw him make a careful note in his pocket-book, and I did not fail to observe that he returned to examine that same cupboard twice more before the day was out. It was I myself, in the course of helping to restore some order to the morning-room, who came upon the final curiosity of that afternoon, a torn envelope, half consumed among the papers scattered near the desk, bearing the printed name of a solicitor's firm in London, a name unfamiliar to me, though evidently not to Holmes, who took the fragment from my hand with unusual quickness. A solicitor's letter, addressed to Sir Reginald, and now torn rather than burned, he murmured. Lestrade will tell you, Watson, that this points plainly enough toward Edward, for what solicitor's business could concern this house, save that which threatens the young man's legitimacy? And does it not? I asked. It may, said Holmes, or it may have been left precisely where we should be certain to find it, by a hand that understood very well how readily we should draw that conclusion. I have observed before, Watson, that evidence which points too eagerly in one direction has generally been given a push. Chapter 5. What the heir feared. Holmes determined, upon the morning of our second full day at Ashcombe Hall, that he would see each member of the household apart, and it fell to me to sit beside him through those interviews, taking such notes as I could while he pursued, with that quiet persistence I had come to know so well, the small inconsistencies that lay beneath the household's careful surface. Edward Ashcombe came first, and I confess that I approached the interview with no great expectation of learning anything beyond what we already knew. For Lestrade's case against him, however Holmes might doubt it, remained on its face a strong one. Yet the young man surprised me. He sat before us in the library, his fair hair disordered, his eyes red-rimmed from want of sleep, and answered Holmes's questions with a frankness that seemed to me entirely without the calculation of a guilty man. "I will not pretend I'm not in debt, Mr. Holmes," said he. "You will learn it soon enough if you have not already. I owe some £4,000 to men who will not wait indefinitely for their money, and I knew before my uncle ever spoke of the register that he meant to remove me from control of my own income, debt or no debt. He told me so himself, a fortnight since." "And yet," said Holmes, watching him closely, "you say it was not the money that troubled you most." Edward's hands, which had been restless in his lap, went suddenly still. "No," he said low. "It was the name, Mr. Holmes. I am engaged to Miss Lydia Carroway, and her family, whatever their kindness to me otherwise, would not permit the match to stand if I were shown to be no true Ashcombe at all. I have made a great many follies in my life, but I love her, and the thought of losing her through no fault of my own, through some old paper signed before I was born, has kept me from my sleep these 3 weeks past." I saw Holmes's expression shift very slightly, and afterward, when Edward had gone, he remarked to me that the young man's shame had seemed to him genuine, in a manner that greed rarely counterfeits successfully. A man protecting his fortune grows angry when it is threatened, Watson. A man protecting his name grows afraid. I heard fear in that room, not anger, and it is a distinction I do not think we ought to set aside lightly. Major Penrose came next and proved a very different subject, blunt of speech and impatient of the whole proceeding, though not, I thought, from any wish to conceal something so much as from a soldier's natural distaste for prolonged inactivity. "You may as well know it plainly, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself with the stiff economy of movement of a man more used to the saddle than the drawing-room chair. "If young Ashcombe is found no true heir, the title falls to me. I do not deny it, and I will not insult your intelligence by pretending indifference to the fact. But I have accepted a commission in Canada, and mean to sail within the month whatever comes of this business here. I want no dusty English title, Mr. Holmes. I want work and open country, and to be done with the whole tangled business of this family before it swallows me as it has swallowed poor Edward." Holmes questioned him a little further as to his movements on the night of the assault, and received answers that seemed, upon examination, entirely consistent with the accounts of the servants, so that I saw little cause to suspect the Major of anything beyond a bluff and rather weary honesty. Clara Ashcombe followed, and it was from her that we learned a fact hitherto unspoken. She was a slight, dark young woman, with a directness of manner that reminded me somewhat of her uncle, though warmed by a feeling he seemed incapable of showing. "I will tell you what I have told no one else, Mr. Holmes, since it can scarcely make matters worse for either of us now," said she. "Edward and I made an arrangement between ourselves some months ago. He promised that once he came into his inheritance, he would use what influence he possessed with my uncle to permit my marriage to Dr. Vale, a match Sir Reginald has always opposed on grounds of Dr. Vale's want of fortune. I had, therefore, every reason to wish Edward's legitimacy proven beyond question, though I give you my word it was never for money that I wished it." "For freedom, rather," said Holmes. "Yes," she said simply, "for freedom." It was Lady Eleanor, however, who gave us the most curious interview of that long day. She had seemed, since the assault upon Sir Reginald, to carry some private grief beyond the general anxiety of the household, and when Holmes pressed her gently upon the subject, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I have known for some years, Mr. Holmes, that something irregular occurred about the time of Edward's birth. I cannot tell you what, for I do not fully know myself, and what I suspect I will not speak aloud until I am certain of it. I have kept my peace because I believed the past best left undisturbed, and I begin to think now that my silence was itself a kind of wrong." She would say no more, and Holmes did not press her further, though I saw that her words had confirmed some suspicion he had already begun to form. "You observe, Watson," said he, when the day's interviews were done and we sat alone once more before the library fire, "that not one of these 4 persons has shown us the face of simple greed. Edward fears disgrace more than poverty. Penrose desires escape rather than inheritance. Clara wishes only for her own liberty, and cares nothing for the title as such, and Lady Eleanor guards a secret whose nature she will not yet reveal, out of some old loyalty I have not yet fully traced. I begin to suspect, Watson, that we are pursuing the wrong question entirely. It is not who stands to profit by Edward's ruin that concerns me now, but who stands to lose everything should the truth of that old register ever be known." Chapter 6. The Woman Who Remembered the Font. Mrs. Margaret Bell had thus far given us little beyond the composed and unhelpful answers of a servant well practised in the discretion her position demanded, and I had begun to think, as I believe Lestrade did also, that whatever private grief lay behind her manner might have no bearing upon the case at all. Holmes, however, was of a different mind, and it was upon the 3rd morning of our stay that he sought her out alone in the still room where she kept the household's linen and preserves, a small, close chamber smelling of lavender and beeswax, in which she seemed more at her ease than in any other part of the house. "Mrs. Bell," said Holmes, when she had set down her work at his entrance, "you were a young woman in this house, at the time of Master Edward's birth, I believe." "I was under housemaid then, sir, and became nurse to the child not long after. I have served this family one way or another, above 30 years. Then you will remember his christening. I remember it well enough, sir, though I do not see what use such memories can be to you now. Holmes settled himself, unhurried, upon the edge of a wooden stool, and I saw at once that he intended no direct assault upon her reticence, but meant rather to approach it by a gentler road. Tell me of the day itself, then, if you will. Was it fine weather? She answered him almost before she seemed to consider the question. As one answers a question so often turned over in memory that the response comes of its own accord. It was a soft April morning, sir, with a little rain in the night before, so that the lanes were fresh and green, and I recall Mrs. Ashcombe fretted the whole drive over lest the damp should spoil the child's gown. And the church itself, were there flowers? White lilies upon the font, sir, and a great deal of them, for it was near to Easter that year, and the ladies of the parish had decorated it very handsomely. You have a fine memory for such small things, Mrs. Bell, said Holmes, and I thought I heard, beneath the mildness of his tone, the first faint note of the hunter drawing near his quarry. Tell me then, who carried the infant to the font that morning? The change in her was immediate and unmistakable. Her hands, which had lain quiet in her lap through all the foregoing, closed suddenly upon the cloth she held, and the easy flow of memory that had carried her through weather and flowers and gowns halted as though a door had been shut upon it. I do not rightly recall, sir, said she, after a pause that told its own story. It was long ago. And yet you recalled the lilies upon the font as though you stood before them now, said Holmes gently. Memory, Mrs. Bell, does not ordinarily fail so selectively. It retains the flowers and forgets the hands that carried the child past them, only when there is some particular reason for the forgetting. She said nothing further, and Holmes, seeing that he had brought her as far as she would presently go, rose and thanked her, with a courtesy that seemed to trouble her more than any accusation could have done, for I saw her watching him from the doorway with an expression I can only describe as dread, long after we had left her. It was that same afternoon that the Reverend Hargreaves, true to his promise, returned to the hall bearing the old parish register itself, a heavy calf-bound volume whose pages had darkened with the passage of nearly 3 decades. He laid it open upon the library table with the careful reverence of a man handling something at once sacred and fragile, and turned, under Holmes's direction, to the entry recording Edward's baptism. There, Mr. Holmes, said he, the entry stands plain enough and agrees, so far as I can see, with the certified copy that has now gone missing. Holmes bent low over the page with his lens, comparing it minutely against the surrounding entries, above and below, made in the same careful clerical hand of the old vicar who had served the parish before Hargreaves came to it. I watched his face, and saw the small, sharp change that told me he had found what he sought. Observe, Mr. Hargreaves, the formation of the letter E in this entry, as against the E in the christening recorded but 2 lines above, from the same week. He held the page to the window's light. The angle of the pen is subtly different, and the ink, though it has been made to appear as aged as its neighbours, shows beneath this glass a depth of colour that speaks of a younger hand and a more recent bottle. This entry, gentlemen, was not written at the time it purports to record. It is a forgery, and a skilful one, but a forgery nonetheless. The vicar received this with visible distress, protesting that no hand but the old vicar's own had ever been permitted to make such entries, and it was here that he furnished us, without perhaps fully realizing its significance, with the fact that was to prove the turning of the whole case. That is not entirely so, Mr. Holmes, said he, after a moment's troubled reflection. My predecessor's sight failed him greatly in his last years, and it is well known in the parish that he came to rely, for the copying of routine entries upon a trusted assistant, one Thomas Bell, who served the church in various small capacities for a great many years before his death. Thomas Bell, I repeated, Mrs. Bell's father? the very same doctor, a quiet, careful man, much respected in his day. I confess my first thought ran, as I dare say any man's would, to the plainest explanation, that Thomas Bell had been paid, at some time long past, to falsify the register for the family's benefit, and that his daughter's evident distress arose from the shame of that old transaction now come to light. I said as much to Holmes as we walked back toward the hall through the thin afternoon light. "It is the obvious reading, Watson, I grant you," said he, "but I do not think it the true one. There is nothing in the history of the Bell family to suggest any sudden fortune following Edward's birth. No new cottage, no unexplained comfort, nothing that speaks of a bribe well spent. A man does not commit forgery for nothing, Watson, unless the alternative he feared was very much worse than poverty. I mean to learn, before this case is done, what disgrace could possibly have seemed to Thomas Bell a fate more terrible than the crime he chose instead." Chapter 7. The Solicitor's Account. Lestrade arrived at the hall the following morning in a state of some triumph, having received by the first post a lengthy reply from the London solicitor whose torn envelope I had discovered among the scattered papers of the morning-room. He read the letter aloud to us in the library with the satisfaction of a man who believes his case at last complete. "The firm confirms, Mr. Holmes, that Sir Reginald had indeed written to them some 6 weeks since, regarding the legitimacy of his nephew Edward. But here is the interesting part." He tapped the page with a blunt finger. Sir Reginald had gone further than mere inquiry. He had instructed the solicitors to draw up the framework of a settlement, one that would have removed young Ashcombe from the succession entirely, while providing him still with an income, out of what the old gentleman plainly regarded as family duty rather than affection. The title and the estate entire would have passed instead to Major Penrose. That would seem on its face to strengthen the case against Edward considerably, I remarked, for I confess the news struck me forcibly. "It does more than strengthen it, Doctor," said Lestrade with evident relish. "It completes it, for not 2 hours past, upon a further and most thorough search of the young man's chamber, my sergeant discovered this concealed within a leather dispatch case at the bottom of his wardrobe." He drew forth, with something of a flourish, the missing certified baptismal record, creased but otherwise undamaged. "There is your motive, Mr. Holmes, and there is your stolen evidence, found in the very room of the man who had every reason to take it and hide it. Edward was arrested within the hour, and I will own that the sight of him being led from the house, white-faced and protesting still his innocence in a voice grown hoarse with disbelief, was among the most painful I witnessed in the whole course of that troubled case." Lady Eleanor wept openly. Clara stood rigid and silent at the window, watching the carriage bear him away down the long avenue of limes. Even I, who had heard Holmes's doubts expressed more than once, began to wonder whether we had not, after all, mistaken the shadow of a young man's genuine distress for something other than the guilt that so plainly seemed to explain it. Holmes alone remained unmoved by the apparent completeness of the case, and it was that evening, as we sat over a meagre dinner in the small parlour set aside for our use, that he set down his fork and spoke what was in his mind. "You will have observed, Watson, as I did, the manner of Edward's response when that dispatch case was opened before him. Bewilderment, certainly. He seemed as astonished as any of us. More than astonished. Watson, a guilty man, caught at last with the fruits of his crime laid bare before him, feels first and most powerfully the cold hand of the law closing upon his own liberty. He thinks of prison, of trial, of the gallows if the charge be grave enough. Edward asked not once but 3 times as Lestrade's men led him away, whether the original parish register had yet been examined publicly. That is not the question of a man who fears for his neck. It is the question of a man who fears for his name, and who does not yet understand that his greatest danger lies elsewhere entirely. I considered this, and found I could not wholly dismiss it, though I confess the physical evidence weighed heavily against such a reading. But the record was found in his own room, Holmes. However genuine his fear of scandal, The plain fact of its presence there cannot be talked away. Can it not? Said Holmes. A dispatch case is no great puzzle to open for one who has already contrived a false key and a forged letter in this same house. I do not say the record was placed there by magic, Watson. I say only that its presence proves Edward had access to that room, which every soul in this household already possessed, and nothing more. It was Mrs. Bell's reaction, however, that Holmes returned to again and again, in the hours that followed, turning it over as a man turns a coin to catch the light upon its several faces. He had observed her, at the moment of Edward's arrest, standing a little apart from the rest of the household, and had seen upon her face not the grief that marked Lady Eleanor's countenance, nor the rigid anger that held Clara motionless at the window, but something he described to me, with evident care in the choosing of his word, as relief. A housekeeper who has served the family above 30 years, Watson, who nursed the very child now dragged away in irons, and her face shows relief rather than sorrow at his arrest. I ask you, what manner of woman feels relief at such a moment, unless that arrest has lifted from her some fear far heavier than her affection for the young man could outweigh? You believe she fears exposure of her own for something. I believe, said Holmes slowly, that the apparent solution to this case has served someone's purpose rather too neatly, and that the person it serves is not necessarily the person who profits by Edward's ruin, but the person who is spared some other, older reckoning by his conviction. Lestrade sees a young man's debts and a young man's fear of poverty. I see a household in which everyone, from the vicar's register to the housekeeper's memory, has been made to speak a story a little too smooth for the truth it claims to tell. He rose from the table and stood a long while at the window, looking out over the darkened park where, somewhere beyond the limes, the lights of the village and its little church glimmered faintly through the November mist. There is one thing more I mean to examine before I speak another word to Lestrade upon the subject, said he at last. That cupboard in the morning-room, Watson, with its seal so carefully preserved, has troubled me since the first hour I laid eyes upon it. I begin to think it holds a good deal more than old family papers of no consequence, and I mean to know, before this night is out, precisely what lies beneath that wax. Chapter 8. The Wax Beneath the Seal. Holmes would not be dissuaded, and though the household had by then retired, subdued by the day's grim events, he led me back through the darkened passages to the morning-room, candle in hand, with the quiet, purposeful tread of a man who feels himself at last very near the end of a long road. The room stood as it had been left, save that the blood-stain upon the hearthrug had been covered, out of some servant's decency, with a square of clean linen, a small mercy that seemed to me in that hour oddly affecting. "Let us begin, Watson, where we began before," said Holmes, kneeling once more beside the hearth, for I confess I did not carry my examination of this key so far as I might have wished, in the confusion of that first morning. He drew from his pocket the key itself, which he had kept upon his person since the discovery, and held it beneath the candle's light, turning it slowly between finger and thumb. You will recall the film of wax I noted upon its wards. I have since had occasion to compare it, by the simplest of experiments, against a fresh impression taken in softened wax of my own preparing. He drew out from an inner pocket a small flat disc of pale wax, upon which the toothed pattern of a key's edge stood clearly pressed. The correspondence is exact, Watson. This key was pressed, some short while before the assault, into a block of warmed wax, from which impression a temporary duplicate might readily have been cut by any hand with a little skill and a file. There was no trick of string or bent wire employed here, no clever mechanism such as the sensational tales delight in. Someone possessed quite simply a second key and let themselves out again after locking the door behind them, leaving the true key lying upon the floor within, precisely where it ought to be found. He rose then and crossed to the cupboard that had so long occupied his attention, the dark oak press in the corner, whose door bore still in unbroken wax the crest of the Ashcombe family. He examined the seal for a long while beneath his lens, turning the candle this way and that to throw its light obliquely across the surface, until at last he gave a small sound of satisfaction. "Here, Watson, look closely and tell me what you see." I bent as he directed, and after some moments' scrutiny perceived what had escaped me before, that beneath the smooth, unbroken wax now sealing the door, there lay a second and considerably more irregular fragment, thinner and duller in colour, pressed flat as though the door had been opened and resealed with fresh wax laid directly over the remnants of an older seal, imperfectly scraped away. The seal is genuine, in the sense that it bears the true crest and has not been forced, said Holmes. But it is not the same seal that was set upon this door a month ago, nor a year ago, nor at whatever distant time this cupboard was first closed up. Someone has opened it, Watson, removed what they required, and taken great pains to close it again so that no casual eye should mark the difference. He set his tools to work upon the wax with a delicacy I always admired, in a man otherwise so impatient of small courtesies, and within a quarter of an hour the door stood open before us. Within, ranged upon shelves thick with the dust of years, lay bundles of old correspondence, tied with faded ribbon, together with a few ledgers and a small japanned box that Holmes drew out first of all, as though some instinct guided his hand directly to it. It contained letters, some dozen or more, written in a woman's hand grown faint with age, each addressed to "My dearest Charles," and signed, at their close, "Your loving Beatrice." Holmes read them through with a swiftness that belied the care of his attention, passing each in turn to me as he finished it, and I confess that as the true history of the family unfolded itself in that dead woman's own words, I felt the whole shape of the case shift beneath me like sand beneath an incoming tide. Edward's parents, it was now plain beyond any doubting, had indeed been married before his birth, and his legitimacy had never, in point of actual fact, stood in any real jeopardy. But the marriage had been performed quietly, and in Scotland not from any scandal touching the union itself, but because Beatrice's true parentage, had it been known, would have brought upon the family a disgrace considerably graver than any question of a hasty wedding. She was not, as she had been presented to society at the time of her marriage, the daughter of a respectable though modest family of the Shires. She was, in fact, the illegitimate daughter of a woman who had once served as a domestic in a great house, a fact concealed with such thoroughness, and for so many years, that even Beatrice's own son had gone through the whole of his life without the smallest suspicion of it. Charles Ashcombe married her against his father's wishes, said Holmes, laying down the last of the letters, and afterward, upon some reconciliation with the old baronet, the family set about constructing a more presentable history for Beatrice, one fit to be spoken aloud in drawing-rooms, and to make that history proof against any future inquiry, they went further still and altered the baptismal entry itself, so that no searching eye, examining the register in years to come, should find anything there to prompt awkward questions about the exact date of a marriage performed so far from home and so quietly conducted. Then the forgery, said I, beginning at last to see the shape of the thing, was never intended to make Edward legitimate at all. It was intended to conceal his mother's origins. Precisely, Watson. It was Beatrice's secret the register was made to guard, not Edward's inheritance. And I think we need look no further than that truth to understand why the present crime was committed. Someone in this house learned that Sir Reginald intended to compare that certified copy against the original entry, and understood, as we now understand, that such a comparison must inevitably lead a careful eye toward the very deception those old letters describe. That person did not act to save Edward's fortune, Watson. They acted, I am now persuaded, to save a name that was never truly Edward's secret to keep, but belonged, in the deepest sense, to someone who had guarded it a great deal longer than he has been alive. Chapter 9. The Preservation of a Name. Holmes sent word early the following morning to Lestrade, requesting that Edward be brought back to the hall under escort, and that the household be gathered once more in the library, where so much of this strange history had already been laid bare before us. It was a subdued company that assembled there in the grey forenoon light. Lady Eleanor pale and composed beside the great desk, Clara standing near the window with Major Penrose a little apart from her, Mrs. Bell stationed, as always, near the door, as though her place in the house permitted her no closer approach to its family, and Sir Reginald himself, propped upon cushions in a wheeled chair, his head still bandaged, but his eyes, I was glad to see, clear and attentive once more. "I will not keep you long in suspense," Holmes began, when Lestrade had brought Edward, pale but no longer shackled, into the room. "For I think this household has borne suspense enough these several days. I will say first, and plainly, that Edward Ashcombe is entirely innocent of the assault upon his uncle." A murmur passed through the room, and Edward himself, I saw, sat down rather suddenly in the nearest chair, as a man does when a weight long carried is at last set down. "The certified record found in his dispatch case," Holmes continued, "was placed there after the assault, by a hand that understood very well how readily such evidence would be believed. The altered household schedule, the forged note that kept Reverend Hargreaves from the house at the very hour his presence might have proved inconvenient, the duplicate key pressed from wax, all these were arranged with a single purpose, to ensure that Sir Reginald should be alone in this room, undisturbed and unwitnessed, at the hour when someone required him to be so." "Then who, Mr. Holmes?" demanded Lestrade, though I thought his voice carried already some premonition of the answer. Holmes turned, not toward any of the family gathered near the desk, but toward the housekeeper standing quietly by the door. "Mrs. Bell," said he, gently but without hesitation, "I think it is time you told us the truth of your father's work upon the parish register, and of your own part in the events of that night. I do not think I shall soon forget the stillness that fell upon the room in that moment, nor the manner in which Mrs. Bell, after a long silence, seemed almost to grow smaller within her own plain black dress, as though some burden carried upright for 30 years had at last bent her beneath its true weight. My father altered that entry at the family's own asking, sir, a great many years before I was born into his knowledge of it," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "He told me of it only upon his deathbed, and made me swear to guard it, as he had guarded it. I have kept that oath the whole of my life, Mr. Holmes, and I would have kept it to my own grave, had Sir Reginald not determined to tear open a wound that had long since healed over." "You entered this room on the night of the assault," said Holmes, "not to harm Sir Reginald, but to recover the old correspondence and the certified copy, before his comparison of the register could expose what your father's forgery had been made to hide." "I meant no violence, Mr. Holmes, before God I swear it. I had the duplicate key made weeks before, when first I heard him speak of his intentions, thinking only that I might remove the papers quietly and be gone before ever he knew I had been in the room. But he came upon me at the desk, and in his anger seized my wrist, and I struck out with what lay nearest to my hand, not thinking, not meaning what followed. When I saw him fall, I was seized with such terror as I have never known, and it was in that terror, Mr. Holmes, God forgive me, that I thought of the dispatch case, and of how easily suspicion might be turned upon another." "Upon Edward," said Lady Eleanor softly, and there was in her voice more sorrow than accusation. "I did not think, my lady, in that moment of what it might cost him. I thought only of what discovery would cost us all." Holmes allowed a silence to settle before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried a gravity I had not often heard in it. "There is a further truth in this matter, Mrs. Bell, which I think this household should hear, for it explains what mere fear of disgrace could not alone account for. You did not act merely as a servant loyal to her employers. Beatrice Ashcombe was your own elder half-sister, was she not, though the world was never permitted to know it? I saw the shock of this pass through the room like a current, and Mrs. Bell herself seemed, for the first time in all our dealings with her, to lose entirely the composure she had guarded so long." "How could you know that, sir?" The letters in the cupboard spoke of a mother who placed one daughter into service and raised the other, by careful design, for a different station in life entirely. A woman does not commit forgery, risk her livelihood, and now risk the gallows itself, merely from loyalty to an employer's memory. She does so for blood, Mrs. Bell, and for a sister she loved enough to spend her whole life guarding a secret that was never truly her own shame to carry. Mrs. Bell wept then, quietly and without further concealment, and told us, in broken phrases, of a mother who had sacrificed one child's position that the other might rise, and of a promise extracted from a dying father that the family Beatrice had married into should never learn what indignity lay beneath their proud old name. "I wanted nothing for myself, Mr. Holmes," she said at last. "No money, no place above the one I have always held. I wanted only that what my mother built and what my sister became should not be torn down by an old man's pride in his register." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, and I thought I saw in his face something gentler than the keen satisfaction with which he generally concluded a case. "Society's obsession with legitimacy, Mrs. Bell, created the very deception it now condemns you for defending. That is a truth I do not think this family should soon forget. But it is a truth that cannot excuse the blow struck against Sir Reginald, nor the attempt to send an innocent man to answer for it, and that account, I fear, must now be settled by the law. Chapter 10. What a Name is Worth. Sir Reginald's recovery, though slow, was by December complete enough that he could receive us once more in the library, seated now in his accustomed chair rather than the wheeled one that had carried him through the worst of his convalescence. And it was there, in the last days before Holmes and I returned to London, that the final threads of the affair were drawn together. He had heard by then the whole of Holmes's reconstruction, delivered to him privately, and with a tact I had not always known my friend to exercise in the flush of a solved case, and I think the telling had cost Sir Reginald something of his old rigidity, for he sat before us now a man visibly softened, though not, I was glad to observe, weakened by what he had learned. "I will not press for the heaviest penalty the law allows, Mr. Holmes," said he, "though I do not pretend that what was done to me, and what was so very nearly done to my nephew's good name, can simply be forgiven and forgotten. The law must take its course regarding the assault and regarding the false evidence laid against Edward. That much justice demands, and I will not stand in its way, whatever debt of gratitude I owe that unhappy woman for 30 years of faithful service. Mrs. Bell was, in the event, tried for the assault and for the obstruction of justice in the planting of evidence against Edward, and though I will not set down here the particulars of that proceeding, which belong properly to another record than mine, I may say that the court, hearing the whole strange history of loyalty and concealment that lay behind her act, dealt with her a good deal more gently than either Lestrade or I had at first supposed likely. Edward's legitimacy, meanwhile, was placed beyond all further question by the discovery of the Scottish marriage lines among Beatrice's own papers, documents whose authenticity no one, not even the most exacting of family solicitors, could any longer dispute. The forged entry in the parish register was formally corrected under the Reverend Hargreaves's careful supervision, a small ceremony of ink and signature that seemed to me, when I attended it, a good deal weightier than its modest circumstances suggested. It was in the manner of that correction, however, that Sir Reginald surprised us all most completely. Rather than permit the old fiction of Beatrice's parentage to stand, quietly restored and never spoken of again, he chose instead to acknowledge, before the assembled family and before the parish itself, the truth of her humble origins and the courage of the marriage his brother Charles had made against every convention of their class. "I have spent my whole life believing that a name was a thing to be guarded like a fortress, Mr. Holmes," he said to us upon the evening before our departure, "walled about with silence and denial. I begin to think now that a name so defended is worth a good deal less than one that can bear the truth of its own making." Edward remained then, heir to Ashcombe Hall and all that went with it, but I thought, watching him in those last days, that he wore the position with a gravity I had not observed in him before, a young man who had come very near to losing everything through no fault of his own, and had learned something from the nearness of it that no easier passage through life could have taught him. He spoke to me, upon the morning of our departure, of settling his debts in full and abandoning, as he put it, the follies that so nearly cost me a great deal more than money. And I believed him, for there was in his manner none of the easy charm with which he had first greeted us, but something steadier in its place. Clara received within the week her uncle's blessing upon her marriage to Dr. Vale, a match Sir Reginald consented to, I think, with rather more grace than he might once have shown, as though the whole affair had taught him to weigh a man's worth by other measures than his fortune. Major Penrose sailed for Canada before the month was out, and wrote once, I understand, to Lady Eleanor, expressing a plain and evident relief at having escaped an inheritance that had never sat easily upon his soldierly shoulders. As for Lady Eleanor herself, she remained at Ashcombe Hall, her old anxiety for the household replaced, I thought, by something closer to peace than I had seen in her since our first meeting in Baker Street. She thanked Holmes, upon our parting, with a warmth that seemed to embarrass him a good deal more than any accusation could have done, and pressed his hand a moment longer than strict formality required. We travelled back to London together in a carriage grown cold with the deepening winter, and I found myself turning the whole strange history over in my mind, from the forged line in a dusty parish register to the terrible confusion of that locked morning room, and I remarked to Holmes, as the lamps of the city began at last to glimmer through the darkness ahead of us, that the case had begun, for all its violence, in nothing more than a falsehood set down in ink some 27 years before. And yet the deeper falsehood, Watson, said he, did not lie upon that page at all. It lay in the values of those who believed a person's worth could be measured by the accident of their birth, and who would rather forge a register than admit a servant's daughter into their family's history. Men will risk fortunes readily enough for money, Watson, as we have seen in 100 cases before this one. But they will sometimes risk a great deal more, as Mrs. Bell risked her very liberty, for the sake of a name. I have thought often since that winter upon those words, and upon the strange, sad justice of the case that prompted them. Reason, as Holmes had shown it to us step by patient step from a wax-filmed key to a seal pressed twice upon old wood, had exposed the guilty hand behind Sir Reginald's assault as surely as it had ever exposed any villain in the whole course of our long association. But it was not reason alone, I think, that determined what the Ashcombe family would become in the years that followed the truth's uncovering. It was mercy, freely given where the law might have demanded a harder reckoning, and it is that mercy, more than any feat of deduction which I have chosen to set down last in this account, as the truest measure of what was learned at Ashcombe Hall.